I'm very pleased to welcome to the show Allie Stuckey, the conservative millennial. Allie, congrats on all your recent success. You are really providing a much needed balance to the way society views millennials. It's a pleasure to speak with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I know you were watching with great interest, as we all were, this so-called student-led march against guns. What are your initial reactions to what you saw yesterday?
Well, my initial reaction as a conservative is that this is the beautiful thing about living in the United States. Whether I agree with the solutions that the march was carrying or not, I do think it's amazing how young people are free to engage in this kind of protest and are able to criticize the government without fear of being imprisoned. That's something that we take for granted, and something that I first want to say is really amazing and incredible and even admirable, the exercising of our First Amendment rights. The irony, though, is that their First Amendment rights are defended by the Second Amendment. And that's something that I don't think that they understand, is that the only reason that they are free to speak up for the things that they believe in, the only reason that First Amendment right is protected is because of the citizens' right to keep and bear arms, which actually protects us from all kinds of government tyranny. So unfortunately, I'm not sure if it's because they're not old enough to connect this in their brain yet. Actually, I don't think it's an age issue. I think it's unfortunately a side of the ideological aisle issue, is that so many people are unable to connect the importance of the Second Amendment to the preservation of every single one of our rights that's outlined in the Constitution.
Well, you make a great point, because watching those rallies, you saw armed police officers, you saw National Guardsmen,
Exactly.
You saw private security teams everywhere. They were law-abiding, gun-holding, protecting all those people's right to protest, and they could not make that connection. The other thing you brought up that I thought was really interesting is, I agree with you 100%. I'm really thrilled that kids have a platform at any age to speak. Here's the problem, though. Clearly, the kids didn't organize this. It's being sold to us like a bunch of Parkland school kids got together and made this happen. Talk about who's really behind this.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's Democratic politicians and any lobbyist for the Democratic Party and anyone who funds the Democratic Party. I don't know for sure that George Soros was specifically behind this, but I wouldn't be surprised if his funds were behind it in some kind of sense. I think even, and this is not to discredit at all their ability and their bravery to go up in front of their peers and in front of hundreds of thousands of people and make a speech. But it even struck me that both David Hogg's speech and Emma Gonzalez's speech, that they very likely had speechwriters tell them, hey, Emma, it would be a really good idea if this speech was the length of time that the shooter was able to shoot at Parkland. And now that is totally conjecture on my part. I don't know that for sure. But even the little rhetorical devices that they used in speaking in front of people, for students who have never spoken in front of people before, I thought they were extremely clever and effective and a little bit too professional. And that's been a complaint that a lot of people have said, that these kids are being used and manipulated as scapegoats by the leftist media and people on the left, rather than giving an even platform to kids who were affected by this tragedy on both sides of the aisle. Kyle Kashuv, I think that's how you say his last name, is a great example of that. He is a Second Amendment advocate. He was also a student at Stoneman Douglas High School, and so he underwent the tragedy, but he has not been given a fraction of the airtime that David Hogg and Emma Gonzalez have, because he doesn't have these Democratic politicians behind him. He doesn't have the mainstream media behind him. And so I think it's really a shame when they headline this movement as a student-led movement. It's not. It's a gun control-led movement. And you should just be honest about that. If that's the movement that you want, fine. But don't put the students at the forefront if you're not willing to put all the students at the forefront.
That's right. And as we know, Kyle Kashev wasn't even allowed to speak. He asked to speak, and he was the one prominent kid from Parkland who has been very vocal about his pro-gun worldview, right. And he was not allowed to speak. And we don't know whether or not Soros is behind this. We know certainly that his money ended up in some of the pockets of some of the people who sponsored this, but we do know for a fact that Planned Parenthood was behind this, which is really, really, really ironic when you think about it. I can't think of any better way to save kids' lives than to get Planned Parenthood to stop doing what it does on a daily basis. So some of the groups that are behind this are really odd. Wanted to ask you, too, about George Clooney's statement, right, that he's proud of his country again. We heard this with Michelle Obama way back in 2008 when they elected Barack, right? I'm proud of my country for the very first time. What is it with some of these radical leftists that they're only proud of their country when the country is tolerating, through our freedoms and liberties, their right to speak their minds?
Right. And it's almost like they are more proud of their country, or they're prouder of their country when our country is apologetic and pretends like we are not the best country in the world. I mean, we know Barack Obama for the past 8 years, he went on his apology tour and he fundamentally changed the way that Americans see America. He actively tried to level the playing field between America and the rest of the world, constantly kind of putting on this posture of shame and of apology, which really polarized the United States, which is why you have people saying they're prouder of the country when we are apologetic, when we look more like Europe, when we don't tout our American exceptionalism, when we try to even the playing field by taking away rights that are unique to Americans that the rest of the world doesn't enjoy, like the Second Amendment. And that's the sad part about it, is that patriotism and the view of America and what makes America great and what makes America unique has changed so much over the past decade. And there's a lot of statistics on this too. You can look at Pew Research, how Democrats changed so dramatically and went further to the left on every single issue while Barack Obama was president. That didn't happen for the 20 years before he was president. And so that's where we are. That's why we have so much tension right now, and so much polarization, because Obama left us with a fractured America, and Donald Trump isn't the most unifying figure either. So we've got a hard road ahead of us as the conservative minority.
Well, shame, as you pointed out, is a huge emotion. It's a very powerful emotion, especially when it's manipulated. And that seemed to be the theme to me of many of the kids' speeches. Not really policy solutions, not really logical, coherent arguments, simply shame on you for not doing what we want. And with that in mind, I wanted to shift a little bit to the millennial generation. Recent studies, as you've talked about, recent studies show that millennials tend to be much more pro-socialism. There's a great story out now that say many millennials aren't saving a dime for retirement because they're convinced capitalism will be eradicated before they even get there, and we'll have a free society. And not surprisingly, another survey says that millennials tend to be stressed out about 60% of the time, that they're constantly worried and anxious. Talk about how all these things fit together in terms of your generation.
Honestly, I think it's giving millennials too much credit to say that they are not saving for retirement because they think capitalism is going to fall. I don't think that they're thinking that far ahead at all. I think that the problem isn't that they think that socialism is going to take over as much as they are addicted to instant gratification. Some of that is our fault, but some of it's not. Some of it's the people that raised us. Some of it's the technology that raised us. We are really the first generation to be able to click on something and have it show up at our door. We are the first generation where we have personal devices that carry everything that we feel like identify us. We are the instant gratification, clickbait, me generation. There's no doubt about that. And that's really affected the way that we see the world, the way that we see work, the way that we see success, the way that we see making money, retirement, deferred gratification, having to wait for things. And now I do not think that millennials are the worst generation that has ever lived, because we have to remember that every single generation has thought that the preceding generation, the generation to come after them, was going to squander everything that they've worked for. And I'm kind of under the impression that every generation thinks millennials are the worst generation that has ever lived, when that's probably not true. There are some good things about us. We are very empathetic. We are compassionate, although that manifests itself in some interesting ways. We're also very innovative and very entrepreneurial. The problem is that we're not able to see the future. I think that's why we advocate for things like socialism. I think that's why we don't save for retirement, because we can only see the here and the now, and we are not good at connecting the here and the now to consequences, which is why we can't look back at history, or we refuse to look back at history and say, oh, wow, well, socialism has never worked. Venezuela is not doing too hot right now. Socialism has actually claimed the lives of 100 million people over history. No, whatever, it'll work. It's not so much that we're thinking about the future, it's that we're not thinking about the future.
And you mentioned millennial empathy. I think that's a great characteristic of my students. I see that all the time. It's also what allows them to sort of be easily misled, right? By the emotional appeal of this gun control push without thinking it through. But on the same token, to give millennials credit, they seem to be more pro-life than the previous couple generations were as well.
I think so too. And it has to do a lot with conservatives, or at least pro-lifers, finally realizing that about millennials, is that millennials, no matter what, are going to care about feelings and care about emotional rhetoric, and are going to be probably persuaded more by pathos than logos or even ethos. And rather than shunning that and saying, sorry, facts, 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 we're not going to talk about the emotional side of it, the pro-life movement has done a really good job of coupling the science of life in the womb to the emotional reality of it. And I think that we can even get better at that. What the left does so well, to their credit, is tell stories. Now, all of their arguments are purely anecdotal. They hardly have any facts to back up their arguments. But there's something to that, is that millennials especially love a good story. We are compelled by a good story. If you look at the media on the left, like Vice and Vox and BuzzFeed, their YouTube channels are made up of stories of people to make a political point. They're not someone sitting in front of you giving you a monologue of why you need to believe something. That is something that people on the right need to do better. We need to be telling stories to millennials about women who have suffered PTSD from abortions, about people who have survived abortions. We need to tell the stories of Down syndrome people who are contributing to society but are being exterminated at a 66% rate here. We need to tell the stories of legal immigrants who are being negatively affected by illegal immigration. We need to tell stories of women who defended themselves with guns. That's not something conservatives do well. We think that policy and facts and monologues are going to change people's mind, and they don't. Stories do. That's where the left has the upper hand on us, and that's what conservatives need to do a better job of.
Yeah, as a professor of English teaching literature, I see that. I see kids coming to college. They're very much drawn to storytelling. Here's the problem I have. Given the left's control of both campus and entertainment culture, the two primary places where stories are framed for young people, how do we get that truth into younger generations? I mean, when I teach literature, I try to get kids to see the human nature of the stories rather than the politics behind it. So give me an example. You just railed off a list of things. Give me an example of how you might tell a story to somebody your age about guns that would counter the narrative we saw in Washington, D.C. this week.
Yeah, so for example, well, I didn't do that. I haven't done this on guns yet, but I have a channel on CRTV. It's crtv.com/Allie, and I do these longer videos every couple of weeks. And that's one of my goals, is to tell the side of the story that we just don't see in the mainstream media, really on the right or the left. So one of the stories that I told last time was a professor who sounds a lot like you, he is a political science professor here in Dallas, and it is his goal every day to teach his students how to think, not what to think. And I really showed how he plays both sides of the aisle. He plays devil's advocate in order to equip his students to think critically rather than just indoctrinate them with a certain political leaning. Even though I'm sure he has political bias himself, it is his goal every day to make sure that he does not let that seep into his classroom. We never hear about those teachers in the news because it's more fun to talk about the teachers that make their students take off their MAGA hats and they're not allowed to say the word conservatism. But the fact of the matter is, there are professors just like you, just like the professor that I interviewed, that actually care about teaching their kids how to think and not what to think. And telling that story and showcasing a professor that's doing it right, I think enlightens people and challenges them to realize, oh, it's not normal, or it's not good, or it's not productive for my teacher to be indoctrinating me with politics every single day. And you can really do that from any issue. You mentioned guns. There is a young woman named Kimberly Corbin. She does an excellent job of telling her story. She was she was a rape victim in college, and she was able to ward off her attacker with a gun. And she talks about how, that saved her life. She was able to go on, get married, have kids. She wouldn't have been able to do that without the protection of the Second Amendment. And so what I'm trying to do, and what I think other people on the right side of the media are trying to do, is tell those stories. And we've seen this a lot with illegal immigration, talking to the angel moms, talking about how their child was killed by someone, by an illegal immigrant. And so I think it's starting to catch on the right. We just we need to pick it up and make sure that we're telling those stories and not just saying, we don't care about your feelings.
One of my mantras in the classroom is always, your politics should never devolve from your professor's politics or from your own political bent. They should devolve naturally, politics, from the pursuit of truth and beauty and morality. And we need more of that as well. And that's where stories come in, because stories that tell universal tales that show how we are all united ultimately as human beings, that's the way to move people. Allie, tell us one more time, please, where the audience can follow you online.
Yeah, so I am a host at crtv.com, so you can go to crtv.com/Allie. I have multiple videos there every week, and through CRTV, I also have a podcast that you can get anywhere that you get your podcast, so iTunes, I think it's on Spotify now, and that is called Relatable. So Relatable is my podcast, and it is a weekly podcast telling you about the most relevant topics from a conservative and Christian perspective and a biblical perspective, obviously. So those are the two main places you can find me. My blog is the Conservative Millennial blog. I'm on Fox and HLN. I'm actually about to be on HLN right now, so if anyone watches that, they can catch me on that. And yeah, kind of all over the place, but those are the main places that you can find me.
The Conservative Millennial, Allie Stuckey, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed it.